My name is Jon O'Brien. I'm the president of Catholics for Choice.
And what is Catholics for Choice?
We strive to be an expression of Catholicism as it's lived, as opposed to imagined from the lofty heights of the Vatican. We're Catholics from around the world who believe that women and men should have choices with regards to their reproductive and sexual health. The majority of Catholics actually support that position because no matter where you go, from Poland to the Philippines to Portland or Portugal, if you ask a Catholic, do they use contraception? The answer is yes. If you ask a Catholic, do they believe in a woman's right to choose? You'll often find the answer is yes. As recently, they changed the law in Mexico and in Portugal, two predominantly Catholic countries. So ordinary Catholics support sexual health and reproductive rights. We just have a small problem with the leadership in our church.
Now, why does the leadership oppose choice?
Well, it's a very interesting story. If you go back to the 1960s, John Paul XXIII, he brought into the church a thing called aggiornamento, or a bringing up to date in the church. He was the one who brought in a council called Vatican II to have a look at how they could modernize the church and make it more real in people's lives. As part of that process, he started a thing called the Birth Control Commission. It's basically a group of people who would look at overturning the ban or whether it should be kept, the ban on contraception. The ban on contraception had been introduced during the 1950s. It was called Casti Connubii. And the reason why they had the ban on contraception is really that there was a disconnect between sex and procreation and people. And people have sex for a variety of reasons I'm sure you're aware of. And one of the reasons is to have children. People also have sex because they want close, loving, caring relationships with one another, and it happens to be enjoyable. The church hierarchy at one point lost the connection with that in a strive to, I think, elevate a priesthood or elevate those who are celibate above those of us who actually do have sex and do have families. And they sought to create a control over contraception. The interesting thing about this Birth Control Commission in the 1960s was that they made a small mistake. Rather than just having the usual conservative bishops in charge of it, they brought in some married people. Those ordinary married men and women began to talk about what married life was like during the 1960s if you can't control your fertility. It was terrible. The hearts and minds of the bishops changed. And the majority report from that commission said, you know something, there's no obstacle. All the theological arguments that have been used to stop people using contraception didn't mean anything. The birth control could be allowed in the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, John XXIII had died by that point, and it was Pope Paul VI during the 1960s. He saw the report, saw the fact that the majority of people said that contraception teaching should change, and he said no, there's going to be no change, because if we say we're wrong on this, we believe that the reason why he did it was that basically if we say we're wrong on this, well then we're wrong on everything else. So we're not going to change the position on birth control. Now what that meant in the global north was that a lot of people were very disappointed and very angry. The contraceptive pill was just becoming available in the 1960s, which really meant a great deal for women. It meant that women no longer were able, be forced to have it, like in my country, Ireland, being forced to have, 12, 13, 14 children. It meant that women could control their fertility. Families could have the number of children that they could sustain responsibly. Sadly, that was rejected by the Vatican. Now, in the global north, I've mentioned a lot of countries, and in the global north, Catholics are doing it for themselves. We're using contraception responsibly and having responsible families. The difficulty is for people in the global south, and that's where, if you're up at the United Nations, if you go to the European Union, if you go to here, the United States Congress, you'll see a lobby by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops or by the Vatican. That lobby is trying to stop poor people in developing countries get access to contraception. It's trying to stop people get access to condoms. Recently, in the big presidential spend on AIDS, this thing called PEPFAR, billions and billions of dollars were spent, are going to be spent by the American government to prevent the spread of AIDS. It's fantastic. And to treat people who are suffering from HIV. The bishops lobbied to decouple family planning from that spend, to stop women who are HIV positive getting access to condoms to help prevent the spread of HIV to the newborn children. Absolutely insane and very irresponsible as to why they do this. But it's very important that people understand it's not the Catholic Church that are against contraception. The Catholic Church are the people in that church, and you'll go anywhere in the world and you'll find that Catholics support the use of contraception, support proper family limitation and having the number of children you can sustain. It's the Catholic hierarchy that are hell-bent on trying to stop people having the freedom to choose and be responsible.
So how are you going to change the Catholic hierarchy?
Well, I think the first thing is that the change is already happening, because who's your constituency? That's a pretty important thing in politics these days. And more Catholics around the world, Catholics in the pews, ordinary Catholics, go out and they vote with their feet. They're using contraceptives, buying contraceptives. Even in the Philippines, we find that legislators who are very intimidated by the Catholic Church are standing up to the Catholic hierarchy and saying that people deserve the right to control their own fertility. It's a basic human right that you should be able to control the number and the spacing of your children. If you can't control the number and the spacing of your children, obviously it has a devastating impact on the planet, but it also has a devastating impact upon people. It increases the cycle of poverty that people are in developing countries. People often talk about population control. I'm against population control because I don't feel it's necessary, and I don't feel it speaks to what people really need. People need choices in life. Any study that's been done shows that if you go somewhere and you make contraceptives available, you teach people how their bodies work, people want to control their fertility. Who wants to have 15 kids and die from multiple childbirths, one after the other, that just drain the lifeblood out of a woman? Nobody wants that type of situation. Who wants to have a situation where HIV and AIDS will run rampant when we find out that abstinence-only education programs don't work? Trust people. If you trust people in developing countries, give them access to contraception, give them access to sex education, just as we want to see them having access to clean water, and we want to see them having access to their own economies and being able to develop the land. People act responsibly when they're given the opportunity to do so. The tragedy is that if you go to the UN, you will hear the Catholic hierarchy lobbying against people having choices, against people in developing countries. And for those of us in the global north, I think it's especially incumbent upon us to stand up and say that what's happening is wrong, that people in developing countries have just a right to self-determination as we experience. That's what real development is about.
What kind of impact do you think the Catholic hierarchy's stance has had on the environment?
I think, well, the first thing is that you have to remember is that within the Catholic Church, there's a lot of very positive positions on the environment. And the Catholic Church believes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Many governments of the world don't believe in that. That Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Conference on Population and Development, you'll find within these international agreements some great aspirations about reducing poverty, about creating sustainable development, about making people the centre of development as opposed to economies being the centre of development. So there's many progressive thoughts within the church and actions within the church. You go out to some place like Africa or Asia, you'll find the Catholic Church treating people, the poorest of the poor, and treating and caring for people and supplying them with projects to ensure that they can be self-sustainable. So you find a lot of positive aspects of development aid and concern for the environment within the Catholic Church. The problem is that when it comes down to some issues around sexual and reproductive health, what you'll find is that the Catholic hierarchy are opposing people having those choices. So what I'm saying is that the Catholic Church, in an overall sense, has a very positive attitude towards the environment, that believes that industry shouldn't just have its own way, that industry needs to be sensitive and careful with the land, believing in reduction of poverty through sustainable development and responsible development in countries that find themselves in difficulties at the moment. So there's a lot of positives on the one hand, but on the negative side of it, there really is not the opposition, this myopic obsession with not allowing people make their own choices, their own responsible choices about limiting their family size. And that's the difficulty with the Catholic hierarchy. Now, the Catholic hierarchy say these people should use natural family planning. The problem with natural family planning is that it's not all that natural. Actually abstaining from sex for the type of periods of time and having to observe cycles in the way that they talk about, it's not doable for everybody. In fact, it's not doable for many people. I think natural family planning is fine. If people can use it, I think that's great. It's another choice. But people need access to modern, efficient methods of birth control. And that's what the Catholic hierarchy tried to stand in the way of poorer people getting access to that in places like the UN, places like Congress, and places like the European Union.
How can you, as an organization, hope to affect change within the Catholic Church so that people do get access to condoms and choice?
I think one of the most important things that we can do, Catholics and non-Catholics, is to challenge the power that the Catholic hierarchy try to exercise in governments around the world. They go in and they lobby. They go in and they talk to politicians and they try to intimidate politicians into doing their bidding. Their bidding is about denying people choices about receiving access to contraception. I think it's important that we let our legislators know, Catholic and non-Catholic, that when the Catholic hierarchy speak, they do not speak for Catholics around the world. And we need to lift up the voices of those people in developing countries. The poorest of the poor places like the Philippines, people there deserve a choice. I'm not saying that they have to use contraceptives, because I would be against that. Population control is not the answer. Giving people the choice, that's enough. And we need to make sure that when our governments are making decisions about development aid, that they're not listening to the Catholic hierarchy and what the Catholic hierarchy think poorer people need. They're actually listening to people in developing countries who deserve the same choices that we enjoy in the global north.
Do you think the Catholic hierarchy is going to respond to the mass population stating that they would like choice?
I think what's happened at the International Conference on Population and Development, what was really interesting with the Cairo Conference, that really, the Cairo Conference really brought together a new paradigm in the way that we actually think about development aid. It meant that we were looking at, if you make contraception, if you make services available to people in developing countries, that they do want to control their fertility. The Vatican, going back to Vatican II, actually talked about the importance of people having children responsibly. They talked about the necessity of not just, having children left, right and centre, but actually trying to ensure that you can look after and care for those children. So in Vatican II, it's actually there. Responsible population development is there. Responsible family limitation is there. The difference is that they just don't give us the means to actually do that, and they actually tell us that we can't use contraceptives. It means nothing to those of us in the global north, because we go out and we ignore them. Show me a Catholic who actually does not use contraception, who has a regular sex life, and I'll show you an extraordinary Catholic. But the problem is for those people in really poorer places in the world, that they're dependent on development aid, and development aid is very political. The Catholic Church is a political player. That's the way it tries. It gave up a long time ago trying to preach us into behaving in irrational ways. I believe it's irrational to have sex and not be able to control your fertility. You end up with great difficulties and great problems. It increases the cycle of poverty. Giving people choices with regards to contraception, that's what the Catholic Church is trying to stop at a public policy level. So when the politicians get together and they're signing off on a development aid package, be it the Swedish government, be it the British government, be it the American government or the Japanese government, ensuring that contraception and contraceptive choices are part of that. That's where the real fight is going on these days. There's a fight to ensure that people in developing countries actually have access to those, to the means to control their own fertility.
It seems wrong. Like, why? What is there some sort of sinister motive of the Catholic hierarchy? Like, why on earth would they want to continue the cycles of poverty? Why would they want more people on the planet to degrade the environment? What is their motive?
I think that within the Catholic teaching itself, there's many things that do express concern and care for the environment. And within the Catholic Church, there's many people working to actually make the environment better. In the 1960s, when that Birth Control Commission met, they concluded there was nothing to stop birth control being made available to people. There's nothing within Catholic theology that would mean that there's something intrinsically wrong with using a contraceptive pill. The difference is that in order to allow it, they had to reverse a previous judgment. It's politics. It's the politics of the Church that insists that people cannot have access to birth control. There's no God-given, man-given reason as to why people can't control their fertility.
So how do you change the politics?
I think, well, I want to go back to it again. I think change does come in the Church. With the Birth Control Commission, what you noticed with that was that when a reasonable group of people get together and within the Catholic Church, and they discuss these issues. And they discuss these issues from the perspective of what happens in people's lives in reality, as opposed to what the bishops would like to imagine happens in people's lives. What you actually found was that people said change was necessary and important. And the bishops agreed with that. Conservative bishops in the 1960s said that the policy on birth control should change. It's not going to be a short campaign, because the people who are in control of the Catholic Church after many successive conservative papacies, the bishops who've been put in place are far more opus dei. They're far more conservative bishops who really, their mindset is on an ideology. The fact that the ideology doesn't work doesn't really matter to them. The fact that Catholics ignore the teaching on birth control. Like, to have a law, to have a ruling that we can't use birth control, but all over the world, whenever we have access to birth control, we use it. There's something that's incredibly hypocritical and irresponsible and downright dangerous about that. But those who are in control of the Catholic Church at this point in time, they'll change over a period of time. And change does come in the church. There was a time when we believed in limbo. There was a time when we believed the Catholic Church was not opposed to slavery. So change does come in the church, it just takes a long time. While we're waiting on change to come in the church and working for it, I think it's important that we lift up our voices at a public policy level, and we make sure that politicians know and understand Catholics and non-Catholics, especially in developing countries, but in all parts of the world, deserve the same access to contraception, and no bishop should be stopping us getting that and being able to act responsibly.
What are the steps towards you trying to change the hierarchy to allow choice?
I think that over the last couple of years, what you've seen within the Catholic Church is you've seen great change. I think the first thing is that Catholic people, finding any opinion poll that you will run, from Poland to Portugal to Pittsburgh to the Philippines, no matter where you go, if you ask Catholics whether they use birth control, the answer is yes. If you ask Catholics whether they support international family planning, very often you find yes. People support and want people in developing countries to have the type of choices. If you look at Catholic politicians here in the United States and in other countries, even in places like Portugal and in Mexico City, where they recently legalized abortion, you'll find Catholic politicians are now standing up and saying, I'm Catholic, I have my beliefs, but on some issues I just don't agree with the Catholic hierarchy. And that's where a real change is coming. I told you earlier on that we define church in Catholicism as not being a bunch of guys who are in charge of it. Church is each and every one of us in the Catholic Church. Catholics already support and use contraception. The hierarchy, who control the church in many ways, they do not. I think that what we've seen, though, in the last couple of years with the HIV/AIDS crisis is we've seen more and more bishops come out and actually say, you know something, using a condom is not about preventing the transmission of life. It's about preventing the transmission of death. We've seen far more bishops. Bishop Kevin Dowling in Rustenburg, South Africa, he works with the poorest of the poor in the ghettos. And he knows that making condoms available is one of the most important, responsible, caring and loving things that we can do. It's downright Christian. So I think what we're seeing is we're already seeing the cracks in a structure that has no supports behind it whatsoever. Catholic people don't believe in the ban on contraception. The bishops know the ban on condoms is downright irresponsible. At the end of the day, a structure that does not have supports will crumble. And it's not the Catholic Church that will crumble. It's really an outdated, irresponsible ideology that really causes great suffering and death around the world.
Are there any bishops that you know of that are actively working to change this, other than the one in South Africa?
One of the difficulties within the Catholic Church is that if you're within the Catholic Church, if you're in the pay of the Catholic Church, if they pay your salary and look after the roof over your head, it's very difficult to dissent. So in other words, anyone who disagrees is silenced, sends off to some remote region and is never really heard from much again. And that's happened to a lot of priests and nuns and bishops, far more than you would think. A lot of people have left the church. A lot of bishops and priests, especially when the ban on contraception came, decided that in good conscience they couldn't continue within the church. And then there's many of us then within the church who still are Catholic, who work and argue for change. We want to see that same miracle that happened back in the 1960s in the Birth Control Commission, when those bishops actually, their hearts and minds changed and they said that contraception could be available. We'd like to see that happen. And in the interim, we plan to work politically to ensure that the power of the Catholic hierarchy does not mean that people are denied their access and their freedoms.
So you, as a contraception-using Catholic, are you viewed as bad in the eyes of the hierarchy and the Pope?
I think what's important about, the definition of what a good Catholic is. I'm very, very clear in my conscience that, conscience is very important within Catholic theology. We're not supposed to follow our consciences. We're required to follow our consciences. And what you find with Catholics is that that's what Catholics do. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. We know it's a good and responsible thing to use contraception. We know it's good, loving and caring to use a condom. So Catholics are following their consciences. And as long as we do that, we are good Catholics. So nobody, no bishop, no priest, no pope, can tell us that we are bad Catholics. We are the ones who are holding the true tradition of the Church. That's a tradition that Jesus established, and that's a tradition that we believe is a tradition that respects the differences that people have, that supports people in their real life situations, as opposed to trying to imagine an outdated, an outmoded, and a irresponsible ideology onto people's lives. People don't need that. And especially those people in developing countries, those poorer people in the world, they don't need to be told what to do and what a good Catholic and a bad Catholic is. Give them access to choice, give them access to contraception, and they will show that they know the responsible choices for them, their families, their community, and the environment.
Would they call you a bad Catholic, though, for what you're doing to promote choice in condoms and contraception?
People have different views. I don't drink the bishop's Kool-Aid. As far as I'm concerned, what's important in life is that you are clear about what you believe in. I would say that you can look at any opinion poll in any parts of the world, and you'll find that the majority of Catholics believe the exact same that I do. So if we all believe that contraception is okay, and we use contraception, and we support it for the people, there must be very, very few people who actually disagree with us. So in my view, we are the Church. In my view, I think that there's a misunderstanding about Catholicism. Many people believe that, for example, everything the Pope says is infallible. This is not true. There's only 3 or 4 statements that the Pope has made that actually are infallible. So we don't have to do what the bishops and the Pope tells us to do. What we have to do is we have to pay attention to what they're saying and take it very seriously. And we're required to discern, to really think about whether what they're saying is correct or not. Most of the time, I agree with the Catholic hierarchy. I actually think that our social justice, our view about poverty, our view about supporting the weaker one, the preferential option for the poor, I believe in all of those aspects of Catholicism and more. It just so happens that on some issues around sexual and reproductive health, I'm sorry, but the bishops got it wrong. They made a mistake, and we're suffering as a result of that mistake. And we're required as Catholics to actually speak out about that. And whether someone thinks you're right or wrong, what's very important is that you look at your own heart and you look at the majorities within the Catholic Church who will tell you contraception is right. Contraception is what people should have access to, and a choice to use it or not.
If you can't get this change made within the Catholic hierarchy, is there going to be a drop-dead date where everyone in the Catholic Church believes, all right, that's it, we're out, we're not Catholic anymore, we're going to be this?
It doesn't work like that when you're a Catholic. Just because the leadership has a certain particular view doesn't mean that those who are part of a body should leave and walk off the set. The truth is that Catholics disagree with the hierarchy. They are part of the Church. They're a small part of the Church. They're an important part of the Church, but they're not all of the Church. So from our perspective, staying in the Church, being a Catholic, is incredibly important to us. It's an important part of our world. We are the Catholic Church. And the hierarchy of our Church say they're against contraception. The hierarchy of our Church lobby politically to stop people having access to it. What's important is that we stay in the Church, that we're part of the Church, and that Catholic politicians will go and they'll vote in good conscience They will vote so that people can have the choices in life that they deserve. That's what matters in Catholicism. And so the fact that the leadership in the church have a different view, sure. I'm very happy that people have an alternative view and they have the opportunity to put that view forward. I'll be there each and every time to argue with them, and so will an increasing number of Catholics. I think what's happening within the church is that really, at the end of the day, what the hierarchy is saying is becoming increasingly irrelevant, with large majorities of Catholics behaving differently, with the fact that if you allow contraceptives in somewhere like the Philippines, people will use them. What's it matter if some bishop is alone on a pulpit somewhere telling people they can't use contraception? The power of the bishops is diminishing within the real world that we live in.
Can you overthrow them? Can you put somebody new in there in power?
The Catholic Church, doesn't operate in that particular way. I think what happens is that if you have any type of system, and if it's a system that doesn't speak to the needs of people, the system becomes irrelevant and people begin to behave differently within the system. That's what happens in Catholicism. We have a ban on abortion. Catholics have abortions. We have a ban on divorce. Last time I looked, there's a lot of divorced Catholics that I know. We have a ban on contraception. Catholics use contraception. Oh, and by the way, homosexuality is not acceptable either. Last time I knew a lot of gay and lesbian and transgender Catholics. So the truth is that all of these rules and regulations don't mean a lot when you don't have anybody who's actually following them. The real essence of the problem is when the Catholic hierarchy tried to influence politics, tried to influence politicians, tried to deny those people in the Philippines access to development aid that would include contraception. That's where it hurts people, and that's where our focus is. Change within the church. I think the church has changed over decades. The church will change in the future. But rather than hold my breath for that, I prefer to work in the real world where the rubber hits the road, where really the pain and the suffering of people not having access to contraception can cause death and suffering. That's politically.
Isn't it a great deal of damage when the Pope shows up in the Philippines or somewhere along the equator in Africa and says you can't use condoms, which allows the spread of disease and mass overpopulation in some of these areas?
I think people make a very good point when they say that it can cause great damage, especially in developing countries. In my own country, Ireland, a long, long time ago, I don't think it would happen today, but when the Pope visited, he spoke against contraception. Women went into the clinics and had their IUDs removed, discontinued their pills. We had a slight birth surge. A lot of John Pauls resulted as a result of that. And that was a small situation in Ireland, but I'm painfully aware that there is a truth that when the Catholic hierarchy, especially in developing countries, intimidate politicians and preach against contraception, it can have a solely negative effect. And that's why we're working with Catholics, not just here in the United States, but working with Catholics across Latin America, beginning to work now with Catholics in Africa, been working with Catholics in Europe for a long time, and with good contacts with Catholics in Asia, because it's the Catholic people who are going to make the change. And we can't wait on a hierarchy to change. And we ourselves as Catholics have to speak up in favor of responsible parenthood. I believe that people have a right to have children. I think it's important that we have that freedom. I don't believe in population control. I believe that people do make responsible choices once they're given the means to do so. I think the Catholic hierarchy can have a negative effect in the short term on people's choices. But in the longer term, I think the people will win through.
And how can you get the people to have as large a voice to the Catholics around the equator or in Asia as the Pope walking in there and saying no condoms, no contraception?
Well, it's interesting. The Pope can give one speech, he can have one conversation. But it's the conversation that Catholics have every day. It's the conversations that we have over the breakfast table. It's the conversations that we have in the work canteen. It's the conversations we have in the bar at night. It really is. Catholics are talking to one another about these ethical and moral issues. We've been in dialogue for a long time now in the global north, and we've really basically thrown off the control that the Catholic hierarchy tried to exercise over us with regards to sexual and reproductive health. I don't believe that Catholics in the global north, in developed countries, really pay a lot of attention to the priest saying that you can't use contraception. In fact, the priests in the global north have sort of stopped preaching about contraception. So if you go to Mass on Sunday, you won't find them giving a sermon about don't use birth control, because they actually would like someone to go to the church, and they know that we won't turn up on Sunday if we get too much of that useless, irresponsible ideology. So in the global north, they've stopped preaching that. In the global south, there still is that struggle going on, and it'll be the conversations between Catholics. It'll be when Catholic politicians have the confidence and the guts to stand up and to say, you know something, I'm legislating for people. I'm not legislating for the Pope. It was John F. Kennedy during his presidential run when he was asked about being a Catholic, and he talked about legislating for American people. That's the type of role model that we're seeing played out now in different parts of the world by Catholic legislators who are standing up and saying, it's my job to legislate for the health and welfare of people, not to do the bidding of what the Pope believes. And the reason for that is that the ideology that created this anti-contraception, anti-choice perspective is really a failed ideology. It's an ideology that's built upon really the failure of the Catholic hierarchy to admit the truth. They got it wrong. The ban on contraception doesn't make sense from a theological point of view. It doesn't make sense from a personal individual perspective. It doesn't make sense for families. If you want strong families, you don't force people to give birth. There's something that's very Ceausescu, Romania's Ceausescu, where people were forced to give birth. There's something that smacks of that type of totalitarianism, to actually force people to give birth or to remove their means to control their fertility, so essentially you do force them to give birth. That type of totalitarianism will always fail and will always lose. I do feel sorry for those people. The Pope is about to visit Africa. I feel sorry for those people who will be subjected to those lectures about not using contraception. I feel sorry for the politicians who will feel intimidated not to accept development aid that includes contraception. But I know that in the long run, it's Catholics speaking to Catholics. It's Catholic politicians standing up. And by the way, it's also people who are non-Catholic saying to their legislators, people who care about the environment, people who care about communities of people that are less well off, actually saying to their politicians, you know something, international family planning, you should back that. You're my legislator. You shouldn't listen to what the Pope says. I think that that's the most powerful weapon that we actually have. It's the weapon that is about speaking truth to power.